Hello again, Jeff Scott of Blackhawk Technical College. As promised in a much earlier class, I'm going to be going over for the 152, 161 ASP.NET class, chapters 14, 15, and 16, and if time, 17 from our book. What that'll mean is we've gone through the first three sections of the book. When we get done with chapter 17, the plan is, as far as finishing the application, chapters 18 on security, 19 on authentication authorization, 20 on email, 21 on configuring and deploying. I'm not going to go over those. And then when we get to the final section of the book, section 5, let's see, which starts on chapter 22. I'm not going to go over chapter 22 on AJAX, nor am I going to go over chapter 23 on WCF and Web API services, but I will go over chapter 24 on ASP.NET MVC, which is the last topic we'll cover in the class. So, in this chapter, as mentioned, you'll learn how to use the grid view control, which lets you display data in rows and columns of a table. So it looks a lot like a spreadsheet. We've talked about this a little bit earlier. Again, it lets you update and delete data with minimal code, and its appearance is customizable. There are three applications in this chapter. There is a product list application, there is a category maintenance application, and I don't remember what the other one is, but there's another one in there too. Okay, so we're going to take a look at all three of them, hopefully at least. So, starting the chapter, page 442, how the grid view control works. As shown on the following page here on 443, here's a grid view control that allows you to update a table, and hopefully you notice when you take a look in here what they've done is they've clicked on someplace in the masks category. So whereas earlier we had edit and delete buttons, once you click on a row to make it active, the edit and delete, the edit change to update and cancel, and the delete goes away. Alright, so as mentioned, the grid view renders its data with an HTML table with one table row element for each record in the database and one table data element for each field in the database. Alright, so the table in this figure, as mentioned, lists some of the basic attributes that you might want to use for the grid view control, and those are the data source ID, because you've got to bind that, the data key names, as it says, the name of the primary key columns, auto-generate columns. So if you don't want things with auto-generate columns, it basically throws it out there for you. All right, and selected index to specify the row you initially want to have listed. Again, most of this code is going to automatically be generated to you by Visual Studio when you drag the control onto the form and then use the configuration wizard. The grid view control again displays data from a data source in a row column format, so it looks a lot like a table. It really is a table. To create it, you just drag the grid view icon out, and to bind it, you use the smart tags choose data source command in order to be able to do that. Sorry, a little problem speaking this morning. Page 444, how to define the fields in a grid view control. Well, if we look again and move up to page 445, what we'll notice is there we have the fields dialog box. By default, the grid view displays one column for each column in the data source. If that's not what you want, you can choose the edit columns from the smart tag, and then you'll get this. When you do this, you got your choice. You'll notice here we've got the ID, the short name, and the long name. But if we wanted to remove one of those, we could click the X. If we wanted to change the order, we could click the up arrow, etc. And also mentioned on the bottom of page 444, instead of defining each bound field you want to include, you can have the control generate the fields for you automatically by, again, clicking right there where it says auto-generate fields. Then a field will be automatically generated for each column in the data source. Because of that, you'll want to move any bound fields that you might have in there. So if there's anything that you've chosen and anything that you've set up, you'll want to remove it. Alright, so again, by default, the grid view control displays one column for each column in the data source. If you want to define the columns yourself manually, you display the fields dialog box as is shown on the screen right now. And again, another way is to use the add new column command. So if I wanted to add a new column in here, I could click add and choose from there. In the bound field properties, you can do a lot of things like format. So for instance, if I had a date field and I wanted it to be formatted for a long date or a short date, or if I had a numeric field here and I wanted a currency, etc., that's typically what I do there. All right. right, on 446, elements used to create and format fields. Again, as we move up to 447, here's the major column fields that are shown right there. The columns element defines the collection of columns displayed for the control, and it's placed between the start and end tags of the group of the grid view control rather. You can place any combination of the remaining elements listed in here that you want to use. All right. The second table lists the various types of style elements that you have. So again, as we saw earlier, you can go in there and you can edit this stuff just about any way you want. Plus, there are auto themes that you can also provide if you want to do that. All right. To enable sorting, simply. All right. It's real simple. The allow sorting equal true, so you can manually add that, or you can literally add it. You can manually add it, or you can add it. You can add it in code, or you can just check a box. Either way, I guess it's manually. So if I come in here, and I think at least I've got the product list. I believe that's the first one that they showed in here. So let's set that as start page. So again, I'm going to show you the example, hopefully at least, the one that's on page 449 in the book. Got a little late start this morning, but hopefully I'll be able to catch up quickly. And it doesn't look like the one. You do notice the sorting here, so there it is by ID, there it is by name, by category, and we don't have any sorting capability for unit price or on hand. If we wanted a sorting capability, let's say for example for unit price, and right now again we don't, but just I can show you it in this too, it'll work just fine. So let's just bring the ASPX file up. We'll go into design mode. We could do it in source mode also. Alright, but in design mode right here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the smart tag. Alright. And actually I think since I've already set them, it would be easier to do it in code mode. So if we look in here, someplace we've got sorting set up. Sort expression equals product ID, and you'll notice that when we get all the way down to on hand, there is no sort expression. So let's add one. Alright, so their sort expression equals on hand. Hopefully I'm not goofing anything up by doing this. If it doesn't work, we'll just go back and try it a different way. No. Sort expression is not a valid member of the item style. Okay. That said to write justified. Now it's looking at this as being one big thing in here, so I guess what I wanted to do was remove that or add that, whatever, and then we'll have to lift this up and put it under the bound field, so that'll have to go up here. So we just remove this. And add it back here. That should get rid of then our squigglies. Looks like it did. Alright, save, and let's run it again. And now we should be able to sort also by on hand. We'll find out. We should have the hyperlink underneath there. There it is. Again, if you click once, it's in ascending order. You click again, it's in descending order. And that goes for all of these. Okay, right now unit price is not one of the ones selected, so again we cannot sort based on the unit price. We could add that, but I think you get the idea. Alright, in some cases you may want the sort expression to be placed on 2 or more columns. If you want that, you just separate the sort list by field names. In this example, they've done category ID and name. Okay, and I did not even notice that, so we can go take a look. All right, and all they're saying is there it is. You put the names in there together. So if we go back and we look at this again, this may not be the example. So if I click on category, all right, there it is, and notice these are in alphabetic order. If I click on name, these are in order by name, but they're no longer in order by category. Okay, all right. So the grid view itself doesn't do any sorting. It relies on the data source to sort the data for you. Paging is much the same way. All right, again, by default, you get something that looks like this. And notice it's allow paging equals true. So if we go back again to our program, and I'll stop the run. Okay, so if we come back up to the top here, make sure I do it right this time. So when we set up the grid view, we want to just say allow paging equal true. So there's our grid view. There it is right there. Okay. Now I believe there's very few records in this particular example, so you won't actually see the paging. I could be wrong. Oh, we do have it. Here it is. All right, so there's page 2 and page 3. All right, and again, if for some reason I didn't want that, I couldn't imagine a reason for that, but I could come in here and just set it to false. Save, stop the run, start the run again, and what you'll notice, start the run again. What you'll notice now when we look down to the bottom, we've got everything listed together. There is no paging anymore. A little harder to read, although there's absolutely nothing wrong with setting it up like that if that's what you want to do. I think it looks much better myself with the paging equal to true. So I'm going to go back and reset it, make sure I didn't break anything. So paging is the ability of the grid view control to display bound page one at a time, and you have control over how many records you want to show on the page. Again, unlike sorting, the grid view control doesn't delegate the paging function to the underlying data source. Okay, but it only works for data sources that are set in the data source mode. So I've got it back again. Okay. All right. Onward and upward to page 452 in the book. How to customize paging. All right. Notice that they talk here that you can customize the way paging works with a grid view control. The two attributes in the first page, or the first table here, the ones that you see, allow paging and page size, say whether or not paging is enabled or disabled, and how many rows, which by default is 10. Okay. You can customize the appearance of the page area by adding pager settings element between the start and the end tags. And the attributes are shown in the second table that you see right here. If you specify numeric or numeric field last, individual page numbers are displayed in the pager area, so you can go there directly. You can use a page button count. You can use the numeric first last. There's a lot of ways that you can set this up. And they show you an example down here of also the first, previous, next, last. When you use paging, you should know by default all the rows from the data source are retrieved. If the data source contains a large number of rows, this can be inefficient. So ASP.NET 4.5 added two properties to the grid view control. Allow custom paging that lets you enable custom paging. Then when the user clicks the pager control, the application can respond to the page index changing events. So you've got some control over it. The author doesn't go into it in any more depth or breadth of coverage than that. So the list application, this is the one I've already shown you. All right, so the following topics as mentioned here present the design and code for the application for this product list application. This is the same one I've been looking at. The application provides for paging and sorting and doesn't require a single line of code. All right, the data in here has been set to display 8 rows at a time. And again, you can sort as we've already talked about. So I've already kind of gone over that. As far as the ASPX, let's just talk about whatever in here, just a couple things. The code behind isn't shown on the example because there is no C code. A few highlights. The columns element contains 5 bound field child elements that define the fields to be displayed by the grid. Again, those as shown on the previous page, on page 455, are ID, name, category, unit price, and on hand. All 5 columns are retrieved from the SQL data source. The first 3 include the sort expression to allow sorting. The 4th includes the data format string, so it's in currency format. And the associated SQL data source, so this is the actual command that runs. Select product ID, name, category, unit price, on hand from products. It's a fairly simplistic example. Alright. Next, as far as being able to update grid view data on 458, as mentioned here on the page, and we'll look at this in a second. Another impressive feature is the ability to update data. Before you can get that up, you must configure the data source with update, delete, and insert statements as described in the last chapter. Once you've done that, you can set up a grid view control by using a command field as shown in the picture here. So a command field is a grid view column that contains one or more command buttons. You've got some control over the way you want these buttons displayed, what they look like, etc. The update and cancel buttons are only displayed if the user clicks the edit button first. You can't display them separately. When the user clicks a delete button, the grid view control calls the data source's delete method, which deletes it. Alright, so if you wanted it to ask the user if they were sure they wanted to do that, then in that case you would have to add some code. Again, when the user clicks the edit button, you get into edit mode. Alright, and so the edit button is replaced by update and cancel buttons, as already mentioned. The select button lets you select a row. It's common to create separate command fields for select, edit, and delete buttons. It's also common to set the causes validation for the select and delete to false, since they don't require any data validation. I wouldn't agree with that with a delete, but that's what the author says on the bottom of 458. On the other hand, you usually leave the causes validation set to true for the edit button to make sure that indeed that's what they wanted to do. Alright, how to use events raised by the grid view control. Here's the ones, and the biggest thing here when you look, notice there's deleted and deleting, edited, there's not an edited, editing, and there's updated and updating. So when you, for example, let's just look at these two. Deleting means that the row is about to be deleted, but it has not yet been deleted. Deleted means it has been deleted. The same kind of thing with updated and updating. So if you want to ask the user if they're sure they want to do that, you'd want to make sure you put that code, the corresponding code, in the deleting or updating event. So these come in pairs. One event is raised before the other. Okay, the most common reason to handle the before action is to provide data validation. In contrast, the after action gives you the opportunity to make the database make sure that it completed successfully. And they show you a little code example here. So here is in the updated. If there was no, alright, if it's not null, this means that there was a problem. So you could say that a database error occurred. Alright, you could let them know. Or if affected rows was equal to 0, okay, you tried to do something and nothing happened. So as mentioned here on the bottom of the page, the grid view control raises various events that can be handled when the data is updated. Okay. To determine if an SQL exception has occurred, you check that exception property. To determine how many rows were updated or deleted, you check the affected rows attribute, just as we just looked at. Alright, as far as inserting a row, this is on pages 462 and 463. Although the grid view control lets you update and delete rows, it has no provision for inserting rows. Alright, you can provide an insert operation with a minimal amount of code, and that's what they show right here. So about 15 or so lines. We'll talk about that in chapter 15 in more depth, I guess. Another alternative is to create a page that lets you insert data into a grid view control. Okay? To provide for insertions, you must first create a set of input controls, text boxes or whatever, to let the person do it. Alright, and this is what we've done here. Alright, so we would set up text boxes for the fields in question. Alright, and make sure that indeed we put values in there or whatever we wanted to do, check for types, etc. So we'd put that in the try statement. If there was a problem, okay, and if there's not any kind of problem, we'd let the operation go through. So as mentioned, the grid view control doesn't support inserts, but you can do it with a minimum of code to provide for it. The page should include controls such as text boxes. Might make more sense to have drop-down list or something else. You know, who knows. To use a SQL data source control to insert it, first set the default value, all right, to the value you want to insert, then call the insert method. It may throw an SQL exception. All right, typically, as it says, the primary cause is a primary key constraint violation because you tried to change a primary key or something like that. All right, next is the category maintenance, and I'm not going to save this. This should be the one that's shown here on page 465 of the book. And it looks like it is. And you'll notice in this case, not only are we showing these with edit and deletes, but we also have the ability to create a new category. All right, so if I wanted to create a new ID, lights. Fog lights. We'll just make them all fog lights. All right, add new category, and there it is. All right, we put them in there because right now we've got it set up in here to work alphabetically based on the ID. If I don't want it anymore, if I want to change it, I could edit it. Fog lighting. And update. There it is. If I don't want it anymore, oh, it's gone. Alright, so this application, as you've already seen, allows you to update, delete, and insert rows into the categories table. The grid view control is used to display the row of categories in the table along with edit and delete buttons. And if you attempt to update or add a row in a column that is blank, we should get an error message. Alright, so if we add a new category, here's the error messages. Alright, as far as the associated ASPX file, and this is shown on page 467. Just a couple of the highlights the author mentions here. Part 1 of the figure, alright, the first part that's in here as mentioned, shows the ASPX code for the grid view control. It specifies that the data source is the SQL data source 1 and the primary key is the category ID. The 5 columns defined display the 3 columns from the data source, an edit button, and the delete control. Part 2 shows the actual data source control. And part 3 shows the input controls, alright, that are used to enter the data for the new category. Remember, the grid view control is bound to the SQL data source control. Alright, and the columns element will include the child elements that you want to have shown. Alright, so that's part 1 there. There's part 2 on page 468. You'll notice there's a select statement in here to get what we want. The delete statement, which again has automatically been provided, and we've got the parameters set up for us. An insert, much the same way, and an update, much the same way. Finally, again, on page 469, you'll notice this is if we want to go and add a new category. And you'll notice if you look in there, the text boxes are used to enter the data for the new row, along with required field validators. Okay? All right. Again, this is much stuff that we've already looked at. All right. The code behind file, as shown here on page 471. As they mentioned here, it says it would be nice if you could create a robust database application without writing any C# code, but you must write code to insert a grid view control and to catch and handle any database or concurrency errors. Remember, the concurrency errors means that 2 people would be trying to update the same table at the same time. The code behind file consists of 3 methods. The first, the button add click that you see right here, sets the values of the 3 insert parameters to the values entered by the user. Then it calls the insert method of the data source control. as mentioned. If an exception is thrown, an appropriate error message will be shown. Second, in the grid view updated, as it says there, that's called after the row has already been updated. It checks the exception property to see if an exception has been thrown. If it has been, it shows it. All right. If there hasn't been any exception, all right, it checks the rows property to make sure that it's not 0, because if it was 0, some kind of a concurrency error occurred. And the third method here, the row deleted, is called after the row has been deleted. All right. Again, it checks for an exception, and the only difference is this method doesn't set the keep in edit mode property to true because you've just deleted something. As far as working with template fields, all right, and this is actually shown, I believe, in the last example that's in here. There's a product maintenance template. And I'm not saving any of these. This looks like a lot like the one that we just looked at, but if we move back into our book onto page 473, they mention although using bound fields is a convenient way to include bound data, the most flexible way is to use template fields, where a template field is a field that provides one or more templates used to render the column. You can do anything you want in these templates, include anything you want: labels, text boxes, data binding and expressions, validation controls, etc. In fact, validation controls for editable grid view controls is one of the main reasons for using them. So in the figure that you see up on the top of page 473, they show you how to create template fields. The easiest way to do that is to first create a regular bound field and then convert it to a template field, which changes it to a template field element and generates the item. Right, it generates the item and the edit item templates that you can use. Once you've converted them, you can edit the template to add any additional elements you want, like validation controls. You can also edit the templates from design view. Okay. So template fields provide more control of the appearance of columns in a grid view than do bound fields. They also, again, permit you to add validation controls. So this template version that they show here, that's on page 474, and it's the one that I brought up also, and it's the last thing that's in the chapter here. It shows a version of the category maintenance application that uses templates instead of bound field controls. Each edit item template includes a required field validator. All right, so if we go back here, again, to the naked eye, I guess it looks the same. Let's come in here and come into costumes, and let's try to remove the short name. See if it allows us to do that. Short name is a required field. All right, so that was added by us. Let's just cancel out of there. All right, so the ASPX code that we'll look at next, it's on pages 476 and 477, all right, shows the category maintenance application. It'll also show the code for the grid view and the validation summary control, so let's take a quick look at that. First, it uses template fields for the short name and long name. Second, the error message attribute provides the error message that's displayed inside of that validation summary control, which you already saw. Third, the text boxes in the edit item templates for the short name and long name include the max length attribute. That way the user can't enter more characters than are provided by the data source. Another advantage of using templates with a grid view control. There's one other difference between this version and the previous one. Because it uses a validation group, it must also use a validation group for the validators that are outside of the grid view control. As a result, 3 validators for the text box as well as the add new category all have a validation group that are assigned to them. Okay, and again, the code is shown on pages 476 and 477. There's the validation group. And that is it for the chapter. So I will come back again tomorrow, hopefully. And on that day, we will go over chapter 15, how to use the details view and form view controls. Wednesday, I'll go over chapter 16, And chapter 16 is on how to use the list view and data pager controls. And then finally we'll look at, if there's time on Thursday, chapter 17, which is on the object